The idea had been seeded in so many teenage minds. You can fake these mental illnesses. You can choose something special and you can claim it, and the whole world will believe you. Their accounts blew up big. They seemed strange, unusual, chaotically endearing. Illness is a justification to dwell in your fictional world constantly. No one can argue against it. No one can tell you to knock it off. The internet now is centralized. It's Googleable. It's a forever thing. Will they be pigeonholed forever as a mentally unstable liar? Faking or bringing on illnesses as a trend is not remotely new. At this point, I recommend you buckle up because it's about to get really fucking weird. So hello, you wonderful citizen of cyberspace, and welcome to a video about the rise of fake mental illness on TikTok and the long and lurid history of equally bizarre youth trends that came before. I'm going to be reading this one at you because I'm sick and brain foggy and there's a lot to remember, but I'm hoping by the end we may have unpicked why it is that certain young people throughout history have been drawn to telling wild lies about themselves and their lives, followed by other teens copycatting, and before you know it, a seriously crazy new trend has been born. And maybe, in part, I wanted to make this video because I'm fully aware that I look just like these kids, with the green hair and the contact lenses and the ears and all the rest of it. And as such, I do not appreciate the reputation of weirdos everywhere being tarnished by this bullcrap. We're not all the same. The earliest era we can clearly observe with regards to destructive teen fads is that of my own generation, the late 90s, because prior to this time, the internet wasn't around to connect or record people. Meaning that strange, deluded teen fads, because believe me, they existed and they were crazy, they would be unique to each high school or city, and above all, there would be no recorded evidence afterwards to cement them in history once it had faded out. But faking or bringing on illnesses as a trend is not remotely new. In the early 1900s, there came the glorification of tuberculosis. How fun! Particularly with regards to women and beauty standards, because TB patients would become very thin and pale, with feverishly pink lips and cheeks and very bright sparkly eyes. So for a time, there was a great romanticizing of this delicate appearance. Women wore pale makeup, pinched their cheeks pink, sought to become unhealthily slender, which of course is a warped little trend that would return like a boomerang in our own lifetimes in the late 1990s with the advent of heroin chic, glorifying the pale, emaciated bodies of drug addicts, with a startling number of young people hurling themselves headlong into feverish dieting and eating disordered behaviours, because at the time it seemed there was no other way to fit in or be beautiful. I've spoken at length on this channel about EDs and the pro-ana communities of the early 2000s, so I'll link that playlist below if you're interested in continuing that particular discussion. The early 2000s were a toxic, tumultuous time to be young, and one of the famous mottos of the pro-ana sites ran, "Anorexia is a lifestyle, not a disease." Genuinely, these kids had woven their own fiction around illness, had brainwashed themselves with it. They wanted to be sickly thin, but they didn't have a problem, a disease. This was just their lifestyle choice. At this point, I recommend you buckle up because it's about to get really fucking weird. Like I said, the first era of strange youth cultures relating to faking illnesses, blurring fiction and reality, telling big lies, and then getting caught up in them, all of that stuff. The first era we can truly study came in the late 90s. There is a clear pattern of a small subsection of the teen to young adult demographic who, to psychoanalyze a touch, I think are intimidated by the adult world. They don't feel ready for the adult world, and as a result, they sink further and further into fictional worlds, often ones that relate to being sick, because if you're sick, you're not expected to do all the adult stuff or, you know, to be fully functional. I think there's a little bit of a link there too. Until, combined with that almost ubiquitous teen experience of not feeling like you belong, of feeling like you're different, they brainwash themselves into believing that they are so different, so special. Perhaps they're something more myth than mundane. In the 90s, the popular teen media consisted of Anne Rice, The Craft, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Charmed, Blade, and as a result, the kids who didn't fit in tended to drift in a kind of dark and spooky gothic direction. Some found their home on the goth scene and didn't feel the need to take it any further. But like I said, there's always the kids who really can't handle reality. The kids who are perhaps autistic or maladaptive daydreamers, or the inattentive ADHD subtype who spend their days lost in thoughts and imaginary worlds. And for these kids, fed a media diet of vampires and witches, many of them wound up blurring the lines of fictional stories and goth scene reality, and coming to believe that they really were vampires or all-powerful sorceresses. Most of the actual interactions between these self-proclaimed teenage vampires took place online or between small groups of friends. And though some of them would grow up to form and shape the real vampire community that spans America to this day, the vast majority of these vampire kids grew out of the whole thing, and most of their conversations are lost to history. Unless you really know where to look. However, I have no desire to send crass herds of modern-day eyes trampling and pillaging and cringing over the innocent pastures of that wonderfully weird past. Their interactions back then were so youthfully open. Yes, they were cringy, but it was such a different time. It was so sweet. They didn't fear going viral. They didn't fear being turned into cringe content. And that was such a beautiful moment in internet culture, when people could genuinely be themselves and say anything that was on their mind, no matter how fucking weird, before all that judgment and nastiness rolled in. From their own testimonials and stories, the real teen vampires of the 1990s hung around Hot Topic, wore long black trench coats, white makeup, and plastic fangs. They liked to scare the normie kids from their high schools by biting each other's necks in McDonald's or hissing at strangers who gave them weird looks. By today's standards, it's obviously very cringe, but remember back then, goths, skaters, and metalheads made up a big subsection of any American high school, and Columbine was still recent history. These kids were not lone oddballs, and they were feared as a genuine threat to morality and even your life. They came out in big groups, and I still remember the days when you couldn't go anywhere without seeing packs of roaming goths, trench coats flapping in the breeze, hair of every colour, huge metal-studded New Rock boots pounding the pavement. And while most teenage groups would have their witches, some, particularly in America, had their out and proud vampires. Goth gangs of the 90s were open-minded, accepting, and they were experimentalists in the extreme, whether that's sexually or otherwise, often dwelling in dull suburban towns with nothing for teens to do after dark. And in the frenzied boredom of this middle-class wasteland with nothing to watch on the limited TV channels of the time, and the internet still in its infancy, there was no mobile phone entertainment, and you made your own fun. You were young, you were restless, you wanted to experience wild nights, new highs. What was the point of breathing if nothing new ever happened in this dumb little normie town? Sometimes the quest for any adventure at all meant drinking your boyfriend's blood, cuddled up in the back seat of his dad's beat-up Volvo, parked in the darkest corner of the movie theatre car park, followed by spilling your own vibrant young blood for him to taste and insisting in fervent whispers as his bright young eyes and plastic fangs gleamed in the shadows of that creaky old car, that now you were both creatures of the night, never to be parted, never to be fucked with again. Some of these kids would be half joking, but others would be deadly serious. You'd slip back into the front seats, wipe the last drying droplets of blood from view, and roll through the moonlit town holding hands, feeling different somehow after the exchange of vital fluids, changed, unstoppable. Your boyfriend would drop you off outside your dull suburban house, and the dark vampiric magic would pop like a soap bubble as your mother ushered you in, told you there was still macaroni on the stove if you wanted it. You scoffed. Macaroni was a concept so dull and human it should be banished from the earth. You swept like a breeze of black velvet away from its cheesy abhorrence. Upstairs inside your room, with its gothic posters and tattered black Halloween fabric draped across the walls, you might put on the Cure, light a stick of incense, maybe smoke a clove out of the window, if you were daring. You'd admire your reflection in the shadowed mirror, peering close to see some change in your eyes, imagining perhaps that they were brighter, greener, more intense, now that you'd fed. You'd flop down on the bed, ignore your homework, and dive into the well-thumbed pages of The Vampire Lestat, that book you'd read and read until it felt realer and truer and more alive than any of the suburban wasteland around you. This place disgusted you, every godforsaken suburban morning, sunlight and orange juice, perky radio voices and your dad sipping coffee. Then at school, those perky normie girls with their beige sweaters and preppy skirts. For these kids, in 2 more years, they'd be at college. 2 more years and they'd move to the city. And there, you just knew, if 200-year-old vampires walked this earth at all, which you just knew in your bones they did, it would be there, in some underground gothic club, that you would finally find them. And that was it. That was the fiction the 90s kids wove for themselves so tightly they fell into it head first, believed it utterly, and sometimes carried that belief all the way into adulthood, judging by far too many hours of my own life spent over the decades reading their blogs and their web pages and their printed literature. Because the trouble with me and my particular brand of autism is that I can get really fixated on these things, but I can't bring myself to lie. I could never personally convince myself that I was a vampire the way these kids did, so I just watched, intrigued, from the sidelines for so long, and as the decades slid by, the next teen trends edged into view. As we approached the 2010s, vampires continued to hold their thrall over the world with Twilight and True Blood, Underworld and the Vampire Diaries, but all these media forms were now holding up an equal to the archetype of the vampire. Werewolves had officially entered the building. There were still the kids convincing themselves they were vampires, probably even more of them by now, given half the girls in school were in love with Edward Cullen. And if you wanted to get laid, pretending to be a vampire was probably a sound game plan. But werewolves were now growling loud in the weirdo kid arena, even getting their own show with Teen Wolf. And some kids, it seemed, felt more kinship with the wolf than with the glittery immortal man. So, this is where the term Otherkin enters the dialogue. Otherkin as a term and an idea actually dates back all the way to the 1970s, initially referring to people who felt a kinship with elves. By the early 1990s, Therians, that is, people who feel a spiritual kinship with a specific animal, that they are an animal soul in a human body, and frequently but not always a wolf. It's pretty much always the cool animals. You don't seem to meet many Therian earthworms, Therian hamsters, stuff like that. It's you know, wolves and jaguars and bears, cool stuff. These concepts and people were emerging en masse onto the net. There is a strong similarity between early self-identified Therians, early real vampires, and the disorder-faking kids of modern-day TikTok. Though the Therians and the vampires were clearly having fun in their new identities, both the vampires and the werewolves were very quick to state that being what they were was not a choice and it was not a fun thing. The Therians quickly came to discover that many of their numbers suffered from autoimmune disorders and migraines, and they also talked about how difficult and repressive it was to be an animal in a human world, that they didn't really fit in, that they couldn't do the things that were natural to them, like that there were a lot of ailments and difficulties that they like to claim came along with it. While the vampires complained of many ailments arising from light sensitivities and the fact that they would feel ill, weak and blood crazed if they didn't feed enough. I need to make an important distinction here that although these kids were living in the fantasy land of mythical creatures, they were also, in their eyes, suffering from a disease with no cure. It was definitely a cool, spooky disease, but at all times it was to be remembered and known. They didn't choose this, they can't change it, and they suffer greatly. Now, I would like to add a small interjection here, because as mentioned, a slim minority of vampires and Therians would stick with these beliefs into adulthood, right up to and beyond the present day. The beliefs of both the real vampire community and Therian meetups have morphed, then settled over time into solid group protocol, with books even being published on the linguistics and social hierarchies of the American real vampire courts. And the part that's really relevant here, and also fascinating to me, is that now the vampires are seeking scientific research into their condition. There are actually enough of them in adulthood to study, in the hope that they may not only be believed, but also find an easier cure for their symptoms than blood drinking or energy feeding. Ultimately, this is to say, as crazy as it sounds, is there actually some truth to these weird conditions? It is undeniable that truly vast amounts remain that we don't understand about the evolution of mankind and the realms that exist beyond the visible. For such a large number of otherwise sane and reasonable adults to insist lifelong that their condition is real? What do you think? For myself, at least, I think one needs to allow for a fragment of possibility. Apart from anything, the world is a far, far more interesting place when you open your mind to its stranger inhabitants. The Therian werewolves would go on to become something of a teenage trend in American schools, round about the MySpace era. Does anyone else remember this? Wearing tails and collars to class, yipping and howling to communicate with one another, wandering around in wolf packs, or popping onto YouTube to record earnest, innocent pleas for other local wolves to contact them because they had no pack yet and they desperately wanted one. No one else here understands me. But round about this time, the modern net as we know it had risen up. Cringe content was becoming a hot commodity, and no one, it seemed, could have fun being unusual anymore without some joyless lump of a being whipping out a smartphone and turning them into a viral meme to be ripped to shreds by other joyless, heartless lumps shackled by a perpetual umbilical cord of scorn and derision to the internet. The real vampire community shrank away into the shadows behind closed doors, and for the most part the Therians too slipped away from the public spaces of the world, until cringe content creators had to resort to going undercover to cosplay and furry conventions, wearing spy glasses so they could observe unusual people finding a rare moment of true joy among like-minded individuals, and they could ruin it utterly. Now, I will be the first to admit that furries in their fursuits kind of give me the creeps. I'm sorry. Something about there being a human disguised as a jolly cartoon animal with sexual undertones. And now I'm expected to play along with this whole fursuit person thing. It really weirds me out. Maybe it's a British etiquette thing. Maybe it's an autistic thing. It's a deeply abnormal social situation, and I don't know where to put myself. I am more comfortable running away screaming. Nonetheless, The sane reaction to being mildly creeped out by people in fursuits is to simply avoid furry conventions, not invade them with a camera to ruin everyone else's fun like some crusty, dusty, soul-devoid black hole of conformity, like some joy-stealing bet you're a laugh at parties enemy of fun. I have far, far, far more respect for most furries than I do for cringe content creators. Like, I get it. Like, all of us stumble onto cringe content now and then, and it can be an amusing half hour, it can. But people who dedicate their lives to just mocking people who are already on the outskirts of society, already probably struggling with bullying and feeling alone and all of that, and you dedicate your life, your platform, your career to invading their safe spaces and tearing them down and making a mockery of them. And oftentimes the people that you're making into memes and mocking and bullying are so young. Oftentimes they're like underage, and you're doing this to them when they're probably getting all that shit at school. They're probably honestly an unaliving risk already, and you're doing that like, it is sick making. It is genuinely sick making. And the thing is, it has contributed heavily to this modern world when no one even dares dance at a nightclub anymore lest they go viral for being cringe. Sweet Jesus, youth should be about letting loose, having wild times, discovering who you are, making mistakes now so you don't have to make far worse ones in adulthood. But now, youth is a dead commodity. No one can enjoy anything lest someone else find them cringe or ick. It's bloody tragic. But this is the world we're in. And to move on to the real subject of this video, just because deciding you're a whimsical mythological creature has become a fading trend doesn't mean that that demographic of kids have disappeared. The autistics, the maladaptive daydreamers, the inattentive ADHDers, and the lost ones who just feel different but don't yet know what makes them special. Kids in this age demographic today are all on TikTok. Becoming TikTok famous has, for many of them, particularly in America, become like the main goal of life. And remember what I said about the vampires and the werewolves feeling like they suffered from a cool, unusual, spooky malady. Something about the cocktail of curiosity, sympathy, awe, and above all, attention that this weird sickness dynamic produces, it's become timelessly alluring. And thus came the first cases of fake Tourettes. 1 or 2 kids on TikTok realized they could make videos randomly bursting out into cute little noises, weird one-liners, or randomized swearing, and claimed that it was all the result of a disorder they couldn't control. Their accounts blew up big. They seemed strange, unusual, chaotically endearing, until the rumours that they were faking it all became confirmed and they were utterly disgraced. But by now, of course, the idea had been seeded in so many teenage minds. You can fake these mental illnesses. You can choose something special and you can claim it, and the whole world will believe you. The fact that this move is guaranteed to wind up in a humiliating downfall generally doesn't bother this sort of kid. They love the attention. Maybe they don't get it at home. Like this whole thing about, oh, attention seekers is like the worst thing you can be. Think about why someone is seeking attention in that way. Think about why they're willing to put their whole reputation on the line, tell such weird lies to get attention. They are clearly desperately deprived of it in some other area of their life. Are they the kid that their parents regard as the spare and all their love goes to their sibling? Like, why do they need this attention? That should be what people ask, in my opinion. They find lying easy, and their brain isn't developed enough yet to truly process risk versus reward, or the full extent of the consequences they're about to risk. More and more teens began faking Tourette's. And the wild thing was, not all of them were even consciously faking it. Doctors around the Western world for a while reported a sharp rise in teenage patients presenting with sudden onset verbal tics. And the weirdest thing was, the tics were frequently the same words that were ticked by prominent influencers on TikTok with Tourette's. For some of these kids, just like when you hang around with someone you admire and you start picking up their accent and their sayings completely unconsciously, ticking had become a social contagion. I seem to recall that the main advice for these accidentally ticking kids was to stop watching Tourette's content and the tics would fade away by themselves. But honestly, Tourette's was already becoming old hat amongst the disorder fakers of TikTok. The kids had already found a different disorder, one that could be bent and warped completely out of shape until you'd taken a living hell and made it look like the coolest thing ever. What I'm talking about, of course, is DID. Dissociative identity disorder, in short, is when severe early life trauma causes a psyche to completely fragment in order to protect itself. Most people with DID don't even know they have DID for a long, long time. They know their memory has huge holes in it. They know they seem to find themselves in places and times they have no memory of reaching, and that people may be unexpectedly furious with them for doing and saying things they don't remember doing and frankly would never do or say. And it can be years, decades even, of this constant confusion, terror and amnesia before anyone works out what's really going on. That another part of their identity, an alter, has taken the driving seat. There are other people living inside your head, using your body as they see fit. Wouldn't you feel scared and violated in that situation? Unfortunately, the TikTok definition of DID has become very different and is constantly changing to fit whatever bullshit narrative makes someone feel special that day. There are endless kids, like a statistically impossible number of kids claiming DID and making videos where they switch effortlessly between alters, something that for real DID sufferers is the involuntary response to a positive or negative trigger and is a draining, confusing, startling brain glitch. In these videos, the kids' self-proclaimed alters all work together on creating little skits, because alters that created from a fragment of your psyche in order to protect you, these alters that pop out when something threatens you, they pop out and they protect you. I'm sure these alters don't mind coming to the forefront to help you with a TikTok skit. It's an emergency survival mechanism. It's not going to be like, hey, let's make a fun TikTok with all our alters today. They're going to cooperate perfectly, I'm sure. Like, oh, lordy, lordy. Or they'll pop in dressed up in different clothes and a bad British accent to show what this alter would look like if they had their own body. Increasingly, DID fakery overlaps with cosplay, roleplay, and otherkin identities. DID fakers will insist that this severe mental condition and rare mental condition can come about without any trauma, spontaneously, at any stage in life. And most of the alters these kids claim are fictives or non-human alters, which is to say they are fictional characters from their favourite books or anime, or they are demons, angels, wolves, gargoyles, you name it. These kids have collected them all, like Pokemon. Now, non-human alters can exist in genuine DID, but from what I've read, they are the exception, not the rule. And they're more likely to appear in very young children or following a severely traumatic event. For DID fakers, though, where's the fun in being 5 different humans when you could be Lucifer, Jesus, Wednesday Addams and Edward Cullen all before lunchtime on an average Tuesday? The question most frequently asked is, why don't these kids just stick to cosplay or role-playing? Why have they got to lie about it? And for most people, that makes total sense. But for these particular kids, don't you see? It's exactly the same mentality as the wolf packs of the 2010s or the teen vamps of the 1990s. Whether it's autism, whether it's maladaptive daydreaming, whether it's histrionic personality disorder, these kids feel the irrepressible need to go deeper. They are fixated on their imaginary life, and they don't just want to dress up in a costume that everyone knows is a costume. They want to eat, drink, sleep, and breathe this reality 24/7. Maybe it's just more tolerable than the real world. Maybe adulthood is just that scary or uninteresting to them. Just like the vampires made it a disease they didn't choose and couldn't cure, these kids choose DID over cosplay because illness is a justification to dwell in your fictional world constantly. No one can argue against it. No one can tell you to knock it off. This disorder fakery gives them the excuse to play act to their heart's content, with the bonus that it links them to like-minded individuals on TikTok, even going to DID meetups and stuff, so they can normalize engaging in fake disorder play and go further and further down the rabbit hole. These days, the mental illness fakery doesn't just sit around DID and Tourette's. There are kids faking autism and ADHD too, believing that ADHD will make them quirky and cute and random. Ooh, squirrel! And that autism will give them the excuse to act like an excited child, and above all, will make this cruel world go easier on them as they infantilize themselves in the guise of autism, to the detriment of actual autistics everywhere. And this, I suppose, brings us to the ultimate question of what can be done about disorder fakers. To which I say, good luck doing anything. As shown, this mindset exists in a small but notable portion of teenagers in every generation. These kids exist in the awkward crack between childhood and adult life. They aren't ready to grow up and take on serious responsibilities, but the world won't let them play all day either. So they sink further and further into a play world of deluded fiction talk that they want everyone to believe is real. For most of these kids, the phase will fade, and they will cringe and hope no one remembers who they used to be. But for a small minority, faking a disorder will become their life. This really is where we split malingering from factitious illnesses. Malingerers are after something. Your money, your attention, the little perks that this fake identity buys them. But the factitious folk, they're in it to be in it. They don't really care about the money or the clout. Like, it's nice, but it's not what really does it for them. They just like the identity of being sick, being cared for, being pitied and worried about. And for these kids, things can get seriously dangerous. Munchausen's disease is a nightmare. I am not armchair diagnosing anyone with this condition, merely ruminating on the statistical likelihood that some disorder fakers may fall into this category. Because Munchausen's isn't just about pretending to be sick. It's about making yourself sick. Whether that involves injecting yourself with poison, self-injuring, or telling dangerous lies to doctors so they perform unnecessary surgeries on you. There was a very, very net famous case of the disorder, who I will not name here out of respect for any loved ones they may have left, who ran the Munchausen's game online for nearly 4 decades. In the 90s, she said she had cystic fibrosis and an eating disorder. She claimed to be dying or on hospice so many times, no one believed her anymore. But then, in recent years, we realized, me and friends who used to know this girl in the 90s, we realized she'd popped back up on TikTok and she was deceiving an entirely fresh audience. And the thing was, by now, she was a wreck. Half her teeth were missing, perhaps due to unnecessary medications drying out her gums. She had tubes in her body to feed her, due either to unnecessary surgeries or the consumption of poisons. And there really can be no other conclusion, for had she truly been even half as sick as she claimed to be in the 90s, if any of that stuff was true, she would not have made it into the early 2020s. And when reports circulated that she died about a year, 2 years ago, no one believed them. It was probably a fortnight or more of seeing various obituaries surface that we truly understood this woman's strange and troubled life had truly come to its eventual close. And to this day, I wonder, did the horrific state she wound up in her final years, did it bring her joy or pain or both? I will never know. The outcome for teenage disorder fakers cannot be individually known, but I will say it was a lot easier to slip out of the identity of the teenage vampire in the 90s than it will be to escape the DID faker stigma of today, because the internet now is centralized, it's Googleable, it's a forever thing. Will they be pigeonholed and cornered into malingering forever because the world will accept them in no other identity? Will they be able to get jobs or university acceptance when the entire world knows them as a mentally unstable liar? Who knows? And that is terrifying, because as cringe and as weird as you may find them, they are just kids or young people. And honestly, I suspect there is some serious mental illness component to their lies, because who else would put on a reputation-risking show like that to the entire world? They are young, they are damaged, and to my mind, they deserve a second chance. Apart from anything, this is clearly an ageless teenage malady, and it could be in another 20 or 30 years that it's your kids who are pulling this shit with whatever disease has become trendy then. Maybe practice some empathy, because you never know. You never know. But if I'm speaking to any kids right now who are a part of this world, who are doing all this, all I ask is that you self-reflect, like journal perhaps, and try to separate and understand what is you and what is a fiction. What is true and what is a desire? What is this fake identity giving you? From the testimonials I've heard of people who have admitted to faking illnesses on TikTok, for a long time they didn't know whether they were really faking it. Like they'd kind of slid into it, and in the back of their minds they kind of knew it wasn't real, but they also felt maybe it is, and they didn't want to let go of that identity, and they were afraid of all of it, you know, of coming clean. I think you've ideally got to have a journal that you know is safe and no one else is going to read, and you need to just be able to ask yourself the hard questions openly. And if you have to destroy those pages and get rid of those pages afterwards to make sure no one else sees them, because I think however young you are, I think you need to have privacy to think your thoughts and to work out your thoughts and to work out what's going on, particularly if you are doing something like this. You need to understand it. And when you understand some of these things, I would take them to a therapist and be honest. Because like I said, I suspect there is some legitimate mental illness in you or severely unmet need. And that needs understanding, ideally before you tarnish your reputation forever. If you're at a place where you know you're lying and you want to stop lying, but the snowball's gotten so damn big you don't know where to hide it, I think the best thing you can do is be honest with these self-reflections, but only if you can take the backlash, because no matter how well you express yourself, and I think there will be sympathy and understanding. If you're quite young and you express yourself well, I think there will be sympathy and understanding, but amongst that there will be cruelty. If you can't handle that right now, I suggest you simply withdraw from the net and from your identity as this fake thing. Go dark for as long as you need. And if this video helps explain anything, maybe share it, link it, whatever helps you. Young people make mistakes. It's kind of the whole point of being young. I don't blame you or hate you, and I really hope I'm not alone in that. And with all of that said, I guess I'll end it here. If you think I missed any intriguing teen fads or anything weird that you were personally involved in as a young person, please drop those myths, legends, and weird tales below. And if you made it this far, thanks for listening. Maybe consider subscribing if you fancy. And I will leave the ED Stories playlist in the drop down if you want to fall down that rabbit hole, only if it is safe and not triggering for you to do so, obviously. And if you have any video suggestions, please plop them in the comments. And with all of that said, over and out. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.